For months, Russian artillery units believed they had solved the war. While infantry struggled and armor burned, the guns remained king. Long-range artillery gave them reach, safety, and a sense of dominance that few other weapons could offer. From positions far behind the front lines, Russian crews fired thousands of shells a day, saturating forests, villages, and crossroads with explosive force. They rarely saw the enemy. They did not need to. Coordinates arrived over the radio, calculations were made, barrels elevated, and the earth itself seemed to obey their commands. Ukrainian soldiers cursed the artillery more than anything else. It was invisible, relentless, and merciless. Russian gunners began to feel untouchable. They set up their howitzers in open fields, beside roads, sometimes even near abandoned farm buildings, confident that distance alone kept them safe. Camouflage became sloppy. Movement schedules predictable. Crews slept close to their guns, ate meals beside stacked ammunition, and joked about how the enemy never seemed able to respond in kind. What they did not understand was that the battlefield had changed in ways artillerymen were slow to recognize. Far above them, beyond the reach of counter-battery radars they trusted, a quiet war of signals and satellites was unfolding. Western intelligence feeds flowed into Ukrainian command posts, blending satellite imagery, intercepted communications, and drone reconnaissance into a picture clearer than anything Russian crews imagined possible. Every firing mission left a fingerprint. Every radio transmission narrowed a location. Every repeated position became a liability. Ukrainian artillery units, once outgunned and outranged, began to adapt. They stopped trying to match volume with volume. Instead, they focused on timing, precision, and deception. While Russian guns thundered day after day from the same locations, Ukrainian crews learned to wait. They watched patterns emerge. They learned which batteries fired at dawn, which preferred dusk, which units stayed too long after shooting. The Russian gunners, confident in their dominance, unknowingly trained their enemy. One evening, as the sun dipped low and shadows stretched across a harvested field, a Russian artillery battery prepared another routine strike. The crew moved with bored efficiency. Shells were loaded. Charges prepared. The gun commander checked his watch. This was familiar territory, a safe routine, another day of unanswered fire. The first shell roared downrange, then the second, then the third. Smoke drifted lazily from the barrel. Somewhere far away, explosions blossomed as expected. The crew relaxed. And then, without warning, the sky answered back. The return fire did not arrive as a single warning shot or a probing round. It came as a coordinated response, precise and overwhelming, striking with a confidence that stunned the men who moments earlier had felt completely safe. The first Ukrainian shell landed just beyond the battery, close enough to rattle teeth and send a wave of dirt and shrapnel through the air. For a split second the Russian crew froze, unable to process what had just happened, because counter-battery fire was supposed to be rare, inaccurate, something they could endure or evade with time. Then the second shell hit closer, followed almost immediately by a third, and panic replaced disbelief. Orders were shouted. Men scrambled for cover. The routine that had once felt comfortable now collapsed into chaos. Trucks started engines too late. Ammunition crates were abandoned where they lay. The guns that had dominated the battlefield moments earlier became immobile liabilities, their long barrels pointing uselessly at a sky that had turned hostile. Ukrainian artillery had not fired blindly. They had waited for the exact moment when the Russian battery revealed itself fully, when muzzle flashes, sound signatures, and electronic emissions aligned perfectly. Modern counter-battery warfare was no longer a contest of guesswork and volume but of integration and speed, and the Russians were discovering that lesson in the worst possible way. As shells continued to fall, the battery commander realized that staying meant destruction. He ordered an immediate withdrawal, but moving heavy artillery under fire is slow, and every second mattered. One howitzer took a direct hit, its crew vanishing in a cloud of smoke and debris. Another was damaged, its wheels shattered, rendering it useless. Survivors fled on foot, diving into ditches and behind low earthworks, their confidence replaced by raw fear. For Ukrainian forces, this moment represented more than a tactical success. It was proof that Russian artillery, once considered an untouchable hammer, could be hunted and punished. Similar scenes played out across the front in the weeks that followed. Russian batteries that lingered too long, fired too often from the same locations, or trusted outdated assumptions found themselves under sudden and devastating fire. The psychological impact spread quickly. Artillery crews who had once fired casually now rushed their missions, shortening barrages, relocating more often, and expending precious time and fuel in constant movement. This reduced their effectiveness far more than any single destroyed gun ever could. Ukrainian commanders understood that counter-battery fire was as much about pressure as destruction. By forcing Russian units to keep moving, to hesitate before firing, to doubt their safety, they regained a measure of control over a battlefield once dominated by enemy guns. The balance did not shift overnight, but it shifted steadily, each successful strike reinforcing the lesson. For Russian artillerymen, the war changed character. The rear was no longer safe. Distance no longer guaranteed protection. Every firing mission carried the risk of immediate retaliation, and every moment spent in one place felt like borrowed time. Some crews adapted, improving camouflage, coordinating movements, and reducing electronic signatures. Others did not, and they paid the price. In retrospect, the period when Russian artillery felt invincible now appears as a dangerous illusion, one sustained by early success and the slow pace of adaptation. When the sky began answering back, it marked the end of that illusion and the beginning of a far more cautious, contested phase of the war, one where even the most powerful weapons could no longer operate without fear. That fear reshaped behavior in subtle but decisive ways, because artillery depends not only on firepower but on confidence, rhythm, and coordination, all of which erode when crews believe they are being watched and timed. Russian gunners began to shorten their firing sequences, sometimes launching only a handful of shells before relocating, trading destructive potential for survival. These constant moves strained logistics, burned fuel, and exhausted crews already operating under pressure. Guns arrived late, fired less, and left early, and the cumulative effect was a noticeable drop in the weight and accuracy of Russian barrages. Ukrainian units on the receiving end felt the difference almost immediately. Positions that once endured hours of continuous shelling now experienced sporadic strikes, intense but brief, followed by long pauses. Those pauses mattered. They allowed infantry to move, to resupply, to reinforce positions that previously would have been abandoned under relentless fire. Ukrainian commanders recognized that they had not silenced Russian artillery entirely, but they had disrupted its dominance, and in modern warfare disruption can be as valuable as destruction. Behind the scenes this shift was driven by an evolving network of sensors and coordination that Russian crews never fully grasped. Counter-battery radars, drones, acoustic sensors, and satellite data fed into a system designed to compress decision-making into minutes rather than hours. A Russian battery that fired repeatedly from the same location was no longer just making noise, it was leaving a trail of data that could be fused and acted upon with lethal speed. The old assumption that sheer volume would overwhelm any response no longer held. Ukrainian forces did not need to match the number of shells, they needed to match timing. Each successful counter-strike reinforced discipline on their side and uncertainty on the other. Russian artillery officers, trained in doctrines that emphasized massed fire and sustained bombardment, found themselves forced to choose between effectiveness and survival, a dilemma with no easy solution. Some attempted to return to older methods, firing from deeper positions, but this reduced range and responsiveness. Others relied more heavily on deception, deploying decoy guns and false firing positions, but these measures offered diminishing returns as Ukrainian detection methods improved. Over time the battlefield settled into a tense equilibrium, where artillery remained powerful but no longer absolute. The psychological transformation was as significant as the physical one. Russian gunners who once spoke of their work with pride and certainty now described it in terms of risk and endurance, measuring success not only by targets hit but by crews brought home alive. Ukrainian soldiers, long accustomed to suffering under overwhelming fire, gained a renewed sense of agency, knowing that the enemy's guns could be challenged, tracked, and punished. This shift influenced decisions far beyond individual batteries, shaping operational planning and strategic expectations on both sides. The moment when Russian artillery felt untouchable faded into memory, replaced by a harsher reality in which even the most feared weapons operated under constant threat. As the war continued, this lesson echoed across the front, a reminder that dominance in modern conflict is temporary and conditional, dependent on adaptation rather than assumption. When the sky began answering back, it did more than destroy guns, it changed how both sides understood safety, power, and the cost of standing still in a war that rewarded those who learned fastest. That understanding spread slowly but relentlessly, filtering through reports, rumors, and the quiet absence of guns that once thundered daily. Russian commanders adjusted plans on paper, issuing directives about relocation times, emission control, and camouflage discipline, yet translating those orders into consistent behavior under fire proved far more difficult. Crews were tired, equipment worn, and the margin for error unforgiving. A single misjudged pause, a delayed move, or a careless transmission could undo hours of caution. Ukrainian forces exploited this fragility with intent, sometimes allowing Russian batteries to fire unchallenged briefly, only to strike when complacency resurfaced. This selective response reinforced uncertainty, making it impossible for artillery crews to know when they were truly safe and when they were moments from destruction. Over time the psychological burden became as heavy as the physical one, because constant vigilance erodes endurance faster than sporadic danger. Artillerymen began to dread firing missions that once felt routine, knowing that every shell launched might be an invitation to immediate retaliation. The rear areas, once zones of relative calm, transformed into spaces of tension where engines stayed running and eyes scanned the sky and surrounding terrain for signs of detection. Ukrainian success in counter-battery warfare also reshaped alliances and confidence beyond the front line. Western observers noted how quickly adaptive integration of intelligence and fires could offset traditional disadvantages, and support increased accordingly, reinforcing the very systems that had enabled the shift. For Russian forces this created a compounding problem, where each loss or near miss validated Ukrainian methods and justified further refinement. The contest became less about who had more guns and more about who could think faster under pressure. In this environment artillery remained lethal, but it was no longer decisive on its own, and its role shifted from dominating the battlefield to supporting maneuver under constant threat. Ukrainian infantry and armor advanced not because enemy guns disappeared, but because they hesitated, fired less, and relocated more often. Small windows of reduced firepower opened opportunities that would have been unthinkable months earlier. Looking back, the moment when the sky answered Russian artillery marked a quiet turning point, not dramatic enough to headline a single battle, but profound in its cumulative effect. It demonstrated that even entrenched advantages can be challenged through adaptation and coordination, and that the perception of safety is often more fragile than the reality. As the war dragged on, this lesson hardened into doctrine on both sides, influencing training, planning, and expectations for future conflicts. Artillery would remain a cornerstone of modern war, but never again with the illusion of invulnerability that once surrounded it. The guns could still roar, but now every shot carried a question, and every pause carried the weight of survival, a stark reminder that in this war, as in so many before it, power belonged not to those who struck hardest, but to those who learned fastest. As that reality settled in, both sides adjusted their expectations of what artillery could and could not achieve, and the war entered a phase defined less by overwhelming force and more by calculated risk. Russian batteries still fired, still destroyed targets, and still inflicted damage, but every mission now involved a silent calculation, weighing the value of fire against the danger of exposure. Some commanders chose aggression, accepting losses as the price of pressure, while others grew increasingly conservative, limiting fire to moments of perceived necessity. This inconsistency further reduced the overall effectiveness of Russian artillery, because coordination suffered when units operated under different risk thresholds. Ukrainian forces learned to read these patterns, identifying sectors where fire slackened and exploiting them with maneuver and infiltration. In places where artillery once froze all movement, Ukrainian units began probing again, testing defenses, advancing meters at a time under cover of reduced shelling. These gains were rarely dramatic, but they accumulated, reshaping front lines through persistence rather than spectacle. Behind each small advance lay countless unseen calculations influenced by the fear of counter-battery fire. The technology enabling this shift continued to evolve, but its greatest strength remained human, the ability to interpret data, anticipate behavior, and act decisively within narrow time windows. Ukrainian crews refined their drills until detection, decision, and response became almost instinctive, compressing what once took hours into minutes. Russian units attempted to respond with increased automation and layered defenses, but complexity introduced new vulnerabilities, and no system proved foolproof. The contest became one of adaptation cycles, each side racing to shorten its loop while disrupting the others. For the soldiers on the ground, these abstract dynamics translated into very real consequences. Lives depended on whether a gun moved in time, whether a signal was detected, whether a response arrived seconds earlier or later. The battlefield rewarded attentiveness and punished routine, and nowhere was this more evident than among artillery crews who had once relied on habit and mass to carry them through. Over time the stories shared among Russian gunners changed in tone, shifting from pride in destruction to cautionary tales about batteries lost and narrow escapes. Ukrainian soldiers, in turn, spoke of moments when the shelling eased just enough to move, to breathe, to survive. These shared experiences reinforced the broader lesson that dominance in modern warfare is fleeting, sustained only through constant learning and humility. As analysts and historians later examined this period, they would note that no single engagement marked the end of Russian artillery's supremacy, but rather a gradual erosion driven by pressure applied intelligently and persistently. The sky answering back was not a singular event, but a pattern repeated often enough to change behavior across entire fronts. By the time this new equilibrium solidified, the war had moved on to other phases and challenges, yet the lesson endured. Artillery remained powerful, but no longer unquestioned, feared but no longer free. In that transformation lay a reminder as old as warfare itself, that every advantage carries within it the seeds of vulnerability, and that those who assume safety in war often discover too late that it was only ever temporary. As this pattern repeated itself across different sectors, it became clear that the change was not local or temporary but systemic, altering how the entire war was being fought. Russian artillery commanders could no longer rely on doctrine alone to guide them, because the environment punished predictability more harshly than ever before. Manuals written for wars of attrition and overwhelming firepower offered little guidance in a battle space where every emission, every movement, and every repeated habit could be detected, logged, and exploited. Ukrainian forces embraced this reality, treating information itself as a weapon, something to be shaped, delayed, or revealed at the right moment. Sometimes they allowed Russian guns to operate freely just long enough to reinforce false confidence, only to strike when that confidence hardened into routine. This manipulation of expectation proved devastating, because it targeted not equipment but decision-making. Artillery crews who believed they had learned how to survive counter-battery fire were often the most vulnerable, convinced that past success guaranteed future safety. The battlefield offered no such guarantees. In response, Russian units invested more effort into concealment and dispersion, spreading guns farther apart and limiting exposure, but these measures diluted the very mass that once made their firepower decisive. Individual guns firing alone lacked the psychological and physical impact of coordinated barrages, and Ukrainian units quickly learned to exploit those gaps. Where fire fell unevenly, movement became possible. Where movement became possible, pressure followed. This incremental erosion of effectiveness mattered more than dramatic destruction, because it reshaped tempo, forcing Russian forces into a reactive posture. Ukrainian commanders began planning operations around anticipated artillery hesitation, building timelines that assumed windows of reduced fire rather than uninterrupted bombardment. This shift marked a subtle but profound change in initiative, one that would have seemed impossible earlier in the war. For Russian gunners, the stress of operating under these conditions accumulated relentlessly. Sleep was fragmented, nerves frayed, and trust in systems eroded with each near miss. Some crews grew hyper-cautious, relocating excessively and sacrificing effectiveness, while others clung stubbornly to old methods, accepting losses as inevitable. Both approaches carried costs, and neither restored the sense of dominance that once defined their role. Ukrainian forces, by contrast, gained confidence not from invulnerability but from adaptability, knowing that even if countermeasures emerged they could be studied and countered in turn. This confidence was grounded in experience rather than assumption, and it proved more resilient under pressure. As weeks turned into months, the memory of a time when Russian artillery felt untouchable faded into something almost mythic, recalled by veterans with a mix of disbelief and regret. Newer soldiers entered the war already aware of the danger, trained in an environment where counter-battery fire was expected rather than exceptional. The culture had shifted, and with it the character of the fight. Observers looking for a single decisive moment would find none, because the transformation unfolded gradually, through countless small interactions that collectively rewrote expectations. Yet its impact was undeniable. The guns still fired, the explosions still scarred the land, but the balance of fear had changed. No longer was terror one-sided. The sky's answer lingered in every firing mission, an invisible presence shaping choices before a single shell was loaded. This was the true legacy of the shift, not the number of destroyed howitzers, but the permanent introduction of doubt into a system that once relied on certainty, a reminder that in modern war, supremacy lasts only as long as adaptation keeps pace with reality. As that doubt became ingrained, it reshaped not only tactics but identity, because artillery units had long defined themselves as the decisive arm, the force that could break resistance without ever seeing the enemy. Losing that sense of assured dominance forced a quiet reckoning. Russian gunners still trained, still drilled, still fired when ordered, but the emotional distance that once insulated them from danger was gone. Every mission now felt personal, every decision weighted with consequence. Ukrainian forces understood that this internal shift mattered as much as any destroyed gun, because warfare is sustained by belief as much as by material. By undermining the belief that artillery could operate with impunity, they altered the mental terrain of the war. This change echoed through planning rooms and forward positions alike, influencing how aggressively commanders were willing to act and how much risk they would tolerate. In some sectors, Russian firepower remained formidable, but it was applied cautiously, unevenly, and with an eye toward survival rather than dominance. Ukrainian units adapted their expectations accordingly, no longer bracing for endless bombardment but preparing to exploit pauses and gaps that emerged with increasing frequency. These moments, sometimes measured in minutes, sometimes in hours, became decisive at the tactical level, allowing movements that would once have been suicidal. Over time, the accumulation of these small advantages reshaped operational possibilities, enabling advances that earlier phases of the war had rendered impossible. Analysts searching for technological explanations often focused on sensors, data links, and precision munitions, but those closest to the fighting recognized that the deeper change was behavioral. The sky answering back had introduced accountability into a domain that once felt distant from consequence. Artillery could still kill, still devastate, but it could no longer do so without exposing itself to retaliation. This reciprocity restored a measure of balance to a battlefield that had seemed hopelessly lopsided. As the conflict continued to evolve, new weapons and countermeasures would emerge, each promising to restore an edge or negate a threat, yet the lesson of this period endured. No advantage remained absolute for long. The side that adapted faster, learned quicker, and questioned assumptions sooner would shape events, even against an enemy with greater numbers or heavier guns. For Russian artillery, the era of unquestioned supremacy ended not with a single catastrophic defeat but with a persistent answer from the sky, repeated often enough to change behavior. For Ukrainian forces, that answer became a foundation, proof that patience, integration, and learning could offset disparities that once seemed insurmountable. In the end, the guns still roared and the war still demanded sacrifice, but the illusion of safety was gone, replaced by a harsher truth shared by both sides. In this war, power was conditional, survival uncertain, and standing still often the most dangerous choice of all.